The bitter Wyoming wind cut through the train station like a butcher's blade, carrying ice that stung exposed skin and froze tears before they could fall. December 1883 had arrived with a vengeance, turning the small railroad platform into a lonely monument of misery. Snow piled against the depot walls and the few gas lamps flickered weakly against the gathering dark. Margaret O'Connor sat motionless on the wooden bench, her tall frame hunched forward, hands clutched around a crumpled telegram. The paper, soft now from being held too often, bore simple words that had shattered her world. Private Thomas O'Connor killed in action. Stop. Body shipped home. Stop. Deepest regrets. Stop. But Thomas wasn't coming home. Not to her. Not to the child she had lost on the way here. Not to the life they'd dreamed about in stolen moments before he joined the cavalry. She had traveled 800 miles carrying their secret, only to find herself alone, mourning in a cold boarding house 2 towns back. Now she waited for a ghost, unable to move forward or back, trapped between grief and the crushing weight of nowhere left to go. The other travelers gave her space. A woman of her height, nearly 6 feet, always drew stares, but tonight she looked like a shadow carved from ice. A giant sitting still in the freezing wind, wearing a worn nurse's cloak, staring at nothing. Earlier, the station master had warned, "Ma'am, you ought to get inside. Storm's getting worse." Margaret hadn't answered. What was cold compared to the ice in her chest? What was a storm compared to the one that had torn her life apart? By nightfall, the last eastbound train had gone, taking with it the final handful of passengers. Even the station master retreated to his office, leaving her alone with the wind's mournful howl. That's when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Through the swirling snow came a lone rider, his horse's breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The man dismounted with practiced ease, boots crunching on the wooden platform as he tied his horse to the hitching post. He was tall himself, though not quite her height, with a weathered face and steady hands. His coat was thick buffalo hide lined with wool, his hat fine but worn. Everything about him spoke of a man who had earned his comfort through hard work, not inheritance. Jonathan Reed had come to town for supplies before the storm closed the pass. But something about the figure on the bench made him stop. He'd buried a wife and daughter, fought in the war, built his fortune from nothing but cattle and grit. He knew the look of someone standing at the edge. He walked closer, spurs jingling softly. Up close, he saw she was younger than he thought, maybe 30, with auburn hair escaping from under a wool cap. Her hands were those of a nurse, steady, clean, and calloused from endless care. But it was her eyes, green as spring grass, that stopped him cold. They didn't just look through him, they looked past him, as if he were already gone. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough from the wind, "you planning on freezing to death out here?" Margaret blinked slowly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm waiting for someone." "In this weather, they ain't coming tonight, I can promise you that. Roads are near impassable." "He's not coming at all." The words were almost carried away by the wind. Jonathan glanced at the telegram in her hands, the military postmark clear enough in the lamplight. A soldier's woman. He'd seen too many like her, waiting for men who'd never return. But there was more here, something deeper in the way she sat, the way she held herself. "You got somewhere to stay?" he asked. A small shake of her head. "Money for a room?" Another shake. Jonathan sighed, rubbing his hands together. The smart thing would be to leave her a few coins and move on. He had a ranch to run, 60 men depending on him, contracts waiting. He didn't need complications, least of all in the form of a heartbroken stranger. But his late wife, Sarah, would have never forgiven him for walking away. He sat on the bench beside her, careful to keep a respectful distance. "I don't know your troubles, and I ain't asking. But you won't solve them by turning into an ice statue. There's a boarding house 2 streets over. It's warm, clean, and quiet." "I can't," Margaret whispered, her voice shaking. How could she explain that moving meant admitting Thomas was truly gone, that as long as she sat there, she could pretend the train might still bring him home? "Can't or won't?" Jonathan asked softly, "because it looks to me like you're choosing to die slow rather than live hard. And ma'am, I've done both. Living's better, even when it hurts." Margaret turned to him for the first time. His face was worn but kind, a scar along his jaw catching the light. His gray eyes carried the same weight she felt, the kind that only comes from losing too much. "You lost someone," she said quietly, "wife and daughter. Fever took them 5 winters back." His tone was simple, without drama. "Thought about following them more than once. Still do, some mornings. But dying's easy. Living takes courage." "I'm tired of being courageous," she whispered. "Everyone I love is gone. Everything I hoped for is ash." "Not everything," Jonathan said. "You're still here. That's something." "Is it?" Quote. Her voice broke. She pressed a trembling hand to her stomach, an unconscious gesture that told him everything. Not just a soldier's woman, a mother who'd lost her child. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and that was all it took. Margaret's composure shattered. A sound escaped her, part sob, part breath, and once it started, she couldn't stop. Jonathan didn't move to touch her, didn't offer hollow words. He simply sat there, a solid presence in the storm, letting her grief run its course. When the sobs faded, he stood and shrugged out of his heavy buffalo coat, draping it around her shoulders before she could protest. "Don't argue," he said firmly. "I've got more at home. You've got nothing but that thin cloak. Now you can sit here and freeze, or you can let me help you to the boarding house. Your choice, ma'am, but I'm not leaving until you do." Margaret looked up at him, this stranger who'd appeared out of the storm like a guardian carved from winter itself. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Jonathan looked out into the snow. "Because 5 years ago, I let pride keep me from fetching help when Sarah was dying. By the time I did, it was too late. I can't save her, but maybe I can keep one more soul from dying alone in the cold. Maybe that's worth something." The wind howled between them, carrying the promise of a long night ahead. Margaret shivered beneath his coat. Her body was exhausted, her spirit nearly gone. "I don't even know your name," she murmured. "Jonathan Reed," he said. "Double R Ranch, about 10 miles north." "Margaret O'Connor," she replied faintly. "Well, Miss O'Connor," he said, offering his hand, "let's get you somewhere warm. Tomorrow's troubles can wait till tomorrow." She stared at his hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, she took it. And as Jonathan helped her to her feet, neither of them knew that this simple act, the taking of a stranger's hand in a Wyoming blizzard, would begin a love story that history would never forget. The moment Margaret tried to stand, her legs gave out. Days of cold and hunger had drained her strength completely. Jonathan caught her before she hit the ground, his arms steady and sure. "Easy there," he said, holding her upright. "When's the last time you ate?" She blinked, trying to remember. "Tuesday, maybe." "It's Friday," he muttered. "You're half-starved." His jaw tightened. "Change of plans. The boarding house can wait." Jonathan half carried her down the snow-covered street, his horse following close behind, reins dragging. The storm was worsening, wind whipping through the empty town. Margaret tried to protest, but every step was a battle between will and weakness. They reached the warm lights of the Cattleman's Hotel. Jonathan pushed through the door, the smell of food and wood polish wrapping around them like a blessing. The clerk looked up, startled at the sight of them. The tall woman, disheveled and pale, leaning heavily on the wealthy rancher known to everyone in these parts. "Mr. Reed," the clerk stammered. "We didn't expect—" "2 rooms," Jonathan interrupted. "The best available for the lady. Send up hot water for a bath. Food, too, something hot. Bread, stew, tea." Quote. "Yes, sir," the clerk said quickly. Jonathan's tone softened only slightly. "And treat her with the same respect you'd give my own sister. Clear?" The clerk nodded fast. "Perfectly clear, Mr. Reed." The climb to the 2nd floor nearly finished Margaret. By the time they reached the room, she was shaking so hard she could barely speak. Jonathan guided her to a chair by the fire and knelt to unlace her soaked boots. "I'll fetch the hotel doctor," he said. "No," The word came sharp and desperate, then softer. Please, I just need warmth, food, rest. No doctors. Jonathan hesitated, reading the truth in her eyes. The fear, the shame, the memory of a loss too raw to name. He nodded once. All right, but if you're not better by morning, I'm sending for him anyway. He left to arrange the bath. Margaret sat alone, staring at the flames, the heat almost painful against her frozen skin. The room was simple but clean. White linens, thick curtains, polished wood. It was the kind of place Thomas had promised her once. The thought brought fresh tears she didn't want. A knock broke her reverie. 2 maids entered, rolling in a copper tub and steaming buckets of water. "Mr. Reed's compliments," one said shyly. "He says to take your time, miss." When they were gone, Margaret approached the bath like a dream. Steam rose, carrying the scent of lavender soap. She undressed slowly, revealing the bruises from travel, the hollowness of hunger, the fragile body that had endured too much. The hot water bit at first, but then it soothed her bones, chasing out the cold that had settled in her soul. She stayed until the water cooled, then wrapped herself in the flannel gown the maids had left. Her hair hung damp over her shoulders as she sat by the fire again, half believing she might finally wake from this nightmare. Another knock came. "It's Jonathan," his voice said through the door. "I've got food." She opened it to find him carrying a heavy tray. He looked cleaner now, fresh clothes, damp hair neatly combed. The smell of stew made her dizzy with hunger. "Feeling better?" he asked, setting the tray down. "Yes," she whispered. "Good. Eat first. Thank me later." Margaret obeyed. The stew was thick with beef and vegetables, the bread soft and warm. She tried to eat politely, but hunger won. Jonathan refilled her bowl without a word. "Sorry," she murmured. "For what?" he said, pouring tea. "For being human." She almost smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Reed." "Jonathan," he corrected gently. "I've had enough of folks calling me mister. Makes me feel older than I already am." "Then you must call me Margaret." "Deal." As she ate, she found herself studying him. His face was rugged, marked by years of work and weather. The scar along his jaw caught the firelight, and his hands, big, strong, handled the delicate teacup with surprising care. "Why the double R?" she asked. "Reed and Reed," he said with a faint smile. "Named it for my Sarah and me. She was half my size, but twice as stubborn. Ran the ranch like a general." His eyes softened. "She made everything better just by being there." "And your daughter?" Margaret asked quietly. "Emma. 4 years old when the fever came. Wanted to be a horse doctor. Said people were too boring because they only had 2 legs." Margaret laughed softly. The first laugh since she could remember. Sound reasoning. "That's what I told her." He smiled, then looked at her with gentle curiosity. "And you? How'd you become a nurse?" "I was too tall for most things expected of women," she said with a small shrug. "But in a hospital ward, height helps. The sisters at St. Mary's took me in, trained me. I loved the work. It mattered." Her voice faltered. "I was good at it." "You still are," Jonathan said. "I don't feel like it." He met her eyes. "You lost someone." She swallowed. "I lost everything. Then maybe it's time to start finding something again." Something in his tone, steady, kind, certain, made her chest ache. Before she could speak, he went on softly. "You don't owe anyone explanations tonight. Eat. Rest. Tomorrow, you can tell me what you need." When she finally slept, it was the first real rest she'd had in weeks. At dawn, the smell of coffee woke her. Jonathan was at the door again with breakfast. "Morning, Miss O'Connor," he greeted. "Morning, Mr. Jonathan." She corrected herself with a faint smile. They ate quietly, the air between them comfortable now. "I was thinking," he said after a while, "my ranch could use a trained nurse. 60 men, their families, and the nearest doctor's a day's ride. I could use someone who knows what they're doing." Margaret stared at him. "You're offering me a job?" He nodded. "Room, meals, fair pay. You'd have your own cabin, your own purpose. You've got too much life left to waste it sitting on train benches." Her eyes filled again. "Why are you doing all this?" Quote, "Because I've been where you are," he said simply. "And because sometimes a stranger's kindness is the only thing that saves us." Margaret looked at him for a long time, unsure if she believed in miracles anymore. But something in his gray eyes, steady and sure, made her wonder if maybe they still existed. "Think about it," he said, standing. "I'll be nearby if you need anything." Quote. After he left, Margaret held his coat around her shoulders, inhaling the scent of leather, smoke, and something warm she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe she could take that job. Maybe she could start again. For the first time since the telegram came, Margaret O'Connor dared to imagine a tomorrow. The journey to the Double R Ranch took 2 days through snow-covered country. Jonathan insisted she travel in the wagon while he rode alongside, making sure the pace stayed gentle. Margaret tried to argue, but her body was still weak and deep down she was grateful. When the valley finally opened before them, she caught her breath. White peaks framed rolling plains, and smoke curled from a cluster of buildings below. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Started with one cabin and a dream," Jonathan said proudly. "Now it's a home for 60 souls and more." At the yard, cowboys paused to stare as the wagon pulled in. Jonathan's voice cut through the murmur. "This is Miss O'Connor, our new nurse. She's here to keep you all in one piece. Anyone gives her trouble answers to me." Quote. A chorus of respectful "yes, sir" followed. He helped her down, guiding her toward a small cabin near the married quarters. Inside was a warm fire, tidy shelves of medical supplies, and a narrow bed. "Your own space," Jonathan said. "Doc Hartley left when he moved east. Thought you might like his cabin." Margaret ran her fingers over the clean counter and the empty jars. "It's perfect." "Good. Supper's at 6. Cookie's bark is worse than his bite. Welcome to the Double R, Margaret." When he left, she stood in the quiet, listening to the faint sounds of ranch life, hooves, hammers, laughter. 6 days ago, she'd been ready to die on a train platform. Now she had warmth, work, and maybe a future. The thought made her dizzy with disbelief. That night, she met Mary Sullivan, the foreman's wife, who arrived with bread and preserves. "You poor thing," Mary said kindly. "Every woman needs a friend out here." They talked while the fire crackled, and for the first time in months, Margaret felt the gentle comfort of conversation. At supper, every eye turned to her as she entered the cookhouse. She straightened her shoulders and smiled, and just like that, most of the stares softened into welcome. Cookie, the Chinese cook, scolded her for being, quote, too skinny, piling extra stew in her bowl. After the meal, Jonathan walked her back through the frosty air. "They'll warm up to you," he said. "I'm used to being stared at," she answered lightly. "Not like that," he said. "You're striking, Margaret. And you carry yourself like you belong. Folks will see that soon enough." Under the cold moonlight, she found herself smiling. "Thank you for everything." "You already thanked me," he said. "Just show up tomorrow ready to work." "That's thanks enough." Her first day began with a wounded ranch hand who'd sliced his palm. Margaret stitched the cut neatly. "Keep it clean," she told him. Word spread fast. Before noon, she was treating a cough, a sprain, and a burned arm. By sunset, she was exhausted, but glowing with purpose. Jonathan found her cleaning up. "Busy day?" "Wonderful," she said honestly. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "The men are already bragging about your needlework. Young Pete's showing off those stitches like medals." Margaret laughed softly. "I have a proposal," he said. "There are 3 other ranches nearby with no medical help. If you visited each once a month, they'd pay you. It'd mean more income and more good done." She looked at him in surprise. "You'd let me go?" Quote. "I'd help you go," he said. "You deserve choices, Margaret." The thought warmed her more than any fire. That evening, Jonathan brought 2 cups of coffee and joined her on the porch. They sat in silence, watching the sunset paint the sky red and gold. "You've given this place life again," he said quietly. "You've given me life again." Margaret's chest tightened. "Jonathan." "I know," he said. "You're not ready. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know that when you are, I'll be here." She looked at his face in the fading light, strong, kind, and honest, and something inside her, frozen for so long, began to thaw. Weeks passed. Snow melted, grass returned, and with spring came chaos, branding season. Margaret worked long days tending burns, cuts, and fevered children. She was exhausted, alive, and happier than she'd ever thought possible. Then came the day 5 men fell ill with food poisoning in the North Pasture. Jonathan refused to let her ride alone. They worked side by side for 3 days, saving every man. On the 4th morning, she collapsed from exhaustion, and Jonathan carried her back to the ranch, refusing to let anyone else touch her. "Put me down," she mumbled. "Not a chance," he said, settling her in her bed and covering her with a blanket. "Stay," she whispered. "Not like that. Just stay." He did, all night. When she woke, sunlight spilled across the room. Jonathan slept in the chair beside her, their hands still entwined. Margaret studied his face and felt peace instead of pain. She lifted his hand and kissed it softly. "Thank you," she whispered. His eyes opened, gray and steady. He brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Always," he said simply. That was the morning she stopped running from hope. In the weeks that followed, they grew closer. Coffee on the porch, shared laughter at supper, quiet moments in the stable. When the time came, love didn't arrive like thunder. It came softly, like spring after a long winter. Jonathan asked her to marry him beneath the cottonwood tree, his voice trembling but sure. "Marry me, Margaret. Let me build a life with you, honest and whole." She took his hands, tears shining in her green eyes. "Yes, Jonathan, I will." 2 weeks later, under that same tree, they spoke their vows. The whole ranch gathered. Hats flew, music played, and Cookie cried openly as the preacher declared them man and wife. When Jonathan kissed her, the crowd cheered, and the wind carried their laughter across the Wyoming hills. From that frozen night at the train station to this warm spring morning, they had walked through grief into grace. 2 broken souls who had chosen life, chosen love, and built something eternal. The story of the rich cowboy and the freezing giant nurse spread through the territory, told and retold until it became legend. But the truth was simpler and more beautiful. They hadn't found each other by luck. They had saved each other. And from that day on, the Double R Ranch stood as proof that even in the coldest winters, love can still find its way home. The wind howled across the Wyoming plains, fierce and unrelenting, turning the sky into a swirling sea of gold and brown dust. Inside the rocking stagecoach, Sarah Mitchell clutched her sister's hand, her heart pounding as the wheels rattled over the rough trail. They had left behind the only home they had ever known in Boston, trading polished streets and gentle manners for an unknown inheritance on the edge of the frontier. Beside her, Emma, her identical twin, stared through the dirt-smeared window, her blue eyes wide with worry. "Do you think it's real, Sarah?" she asked softly. "A ranch? All that land?" Sarah tried to sound confident, but her voice trembled. "It has to be. It's all we have left." 3 days ago, a lawyer's telegram had arrived with shocking news. Their uncle, Thomas Mitchell, had passed away, leaving his entire ranch to them. But if they didn't claim it within 30 days, it would be sold to settle debts. They had no family left, no money, and nowhere else to go. So here they were, 2 city-raised girls heading into a land ruled by dust, danger, and men with guns. The coach jolted violently and came to a sudden stop. The driver's shout was nearly lost in the storm. The door flew open, and wind filled the coach like a living thing. A tall figure appeared in the doorway, broad-shouldered, his outline huge against the red sky. "Ladies," he said, his voice deep and calm despite the chaos around them. "This is as far as the driver's going. Storm's too bad to keep on. You looking for the Mitchell place?" Sarah blinked through the dust. "Yes, we are. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and this is my sister, Emma." "We've come to claim our uncle's ranch." The man studied them for a long moment. Even with the wind tearing at his coat and hat, he seemed steady as the mountains behind him. Finally, he nodded. "Name's Colt Brennan. I've been running the ranch since your uncle fell ill. Nobody told me he had nieces back east." He stepped aside and held out a gloved hand. "Come on, let's get you out of this storm." They climbed down, skirts whipping around their legs, eyes stinging from the wind. Colt grabbed their trunks with one hand each, as if they weighed nothing, and led the way toward the shadow of a large house barely visible through the swirling dust. The driver, eager to be gone, shouted a quick goodbye and turned the coach around, vanishing into the storm. By the time they reached the porch, Sarah could barely see. Colt shoved the heavy door open, and the three stumbled inside. The sudden quiet was almost shocking. The only sound was their heavy breathing and the muffled roar of the storm outside. Colt turned, removing his hat. Sarah's breath caught. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 30, with sun-browned skin, wheat-colored hair, and eyes the color of frozen lakes. His presence filled the room, quiet but commanding. "You're twins," he said simply, his voice thoughtful. Didn't expect that Emma stepped forward cautiously. "You knew our uncle well." Colt nodded once. "He was a good man. Tough as they come." This ranch meant everything to him. Sarah lifted her chin. "Then we'll do our best to honor him and keep it running." A small smile touched his lips. Not mocking, just tired. "You know anything about cattle, Miss Mitchell?" "No," she admitted, "but we can learn." He studied her for another long moment. Those ice-blue eyes, unreadable learning takes time. He said, "And time's something you may not have. There are men around here who'd love to take this land from you. The only thing that's stopped them so far is me." Quote, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "What do you mean? Your uncle's land is valuable. Water, grazing routes, rail access. Men like Marcus Dalton have been waiting for a chance to grab it. If word spreads that 2 young women from Boston own the place now, they'll come knocking, some with offers. Some with guns." Emma's hand tightened around Sarah's. "Then we'll need protection." Colt's jaw tightened. "That's right. And until we figure out who's loyal around here, you don't leave the house after dark." "Understand?" Sarah bristled. "We didn't come here to hide, Mr. Brennan." His gaze met hers. Steady, piercing. "Maybe not, but I intend to make sure you stay alive long enough to decide what kind of life you want." He turned and gestured toward the stairs. "Rooms are ready upstairs. Get some rest. We'll talk more in the morning." As his boots echoed away, Sarah stood in the stillness of the hall, her pulse still racing. Something about Colt Brennan unsettled her. Not just his size or his authority, but the quiet intensity behind every word he spoke. It wasn't fear she felt. It was something else, something she didn't quite have the courage to name. Later, as the storm raged outside, Sarah lay awake in her narrow bed. She could hear the faint creak of floorboards below, Colt moving through the house, checking windows, standing guard. She imagined him out there, his tall frame outlined against the glow of the lantern, watching the darkness beyond the glass for threats she couldn't see. Part of her wanted to feel safe knowing he was there. Another part wondered what secrets hid behind those cold blue eyes, and whether her uncle's most trusted man could truly be trusted at all. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains. Inside, the twins lay awake, hearts uneasy in a house that no longer felt entirely theirs. And downstairs, the giant cowboy kept watch, silent, waiting, and very much aware that danger was coming for all of them. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world shining and new. From the porch, Sarah looked out over miles of open prairie, where sunlight spilled across the hills like molten gold. For the first time since their father's death, she felt something close to wonder. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Behind her, Colt Brennan stood with his coffee mug, tall and silent. "It can be," he said, "but don't let it fool you. This land doesn't forgive mistakes." Sarah turned toward him. "You make it sound like the land's alive." Colt's lips twitched. almost a smile out here. It might as well be Emma joined them, her hair still messy from sleep. "So this is ours now," she said softly. "All of it." "For now," Colt said. "As long as you're willing to fight for it." The words hung heavy between them. Sarah met his eyes. "You think someone's going to try to take it?" "I don't think," Colt replied. "I know." He set his cup down and pointed toward the north ridge, where 3 dark figures on horseback were moving toward them. "And there's your first visitor." The riders approached with confident ease, their horses kicking up little puffs of dust. The man in front was older, with silver at his temples and a sharp, calculating smile. His coat was fine, too fine for a rancher. His eyes, though, were cold as steel. "Marcus Dalton," Colt said under his breath. Dalton dismounted smoothly and tipped his hat. "Miss Mitchell's," he greeted, his voice smooth and polite. "Allow me to offer my condolences on your uncle's passing." Sarah forced a polite smile. "Thank you, Mr. Dalton." Quote. Dalton's gaze swept over them both, and Sarah felt the chill of it. "I hear you've come to claim the Mitchell Ranch." "A bold move, considering the state it's in." "We'll manage," Emma said, lifting her chin. Dalton's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll find it's a hard life out here for people without experience. I could save you a lot of trouble. I'll make a generous offer for the land. Enough to set you both up comfortably back." East Colt stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "They're not selling." Dalton's gaze flicked to him, amused. "Still playing guard dog, Brennan? Thought you'd have moved on by now." "Still here," Colt said, his tone calm. Still keeping watch, Dalton studied him for a moment, then turned back to Sarah. "Think carefully, Miss Mitchell. The frontier can be cruel to those who underestimate it." Sarah met his stare head on. "We'll take our chances." For a heartbeat, the air seemed to freeze. Then Dalton laughed softly and swung into his saddle. "Suit yourselves. But don't say I didn't warn you." He tipped his hat again and rode off with his men, leaving a trail of dust behind. The silence that followed felt heavy. Emma exhaled shakily. "He didn't sound like a man who takes no for an answer." "He's not," Colt said. "That's why, from now on, you don't go anywhere without someone you trust." Sarah looked up at him. "You mean you?" His eyes softened, just slightly. "If you'll have me." That afternoon, Colt gathered the ranch hands in the bunkhouse. Sarah and Emma stood beside him as he addressed the men. "These are your new employers," Colt announced. "You'll take orders from them as you would from me. Anyone who's not on board can collect his pay and ride out." Most of the men nodded, though a few exchanged uneasy glances. One, a tall man with a scar down his cheek, stepped forward. "Begging your pardon, boss, but 2 city girls running a ranch? That doesn't sound like a plan." Sarah met his gaze. "You don't have to like it, Mr. Hayes," he said. "Mr. Hayes." She continued evenly. "You don't have to like it, but if you stay, you follow orders. Otherwise, you're free to go." Hayes's eyes narrowed. For a tense moment, no one spoke. Then he grinned. "Fair enough. Guess we'll see what you're made of." When the meeting ended, Colt caught up to Sarah outside. "You handled that well," he said. "Most people would have let me take over." Quote. Sarah smiled faintly. "If I'm going to run this ranch, I have to prove I can stand up for myself." Colt's gaze lingered on her, steady and unreadable. "You've got fire," he said finally. "Just make sure it doesn't burn you." As evening fell, Colt took them behind the barn to a makeshift shooting range. He handed each of them a rifle. "If you're going to stay here, you need to know how to use these." Emma hesitated. "You expect us to fight." "I expect you to survive," Colt said simply. Under his patient instruction, they learned how to hold the rifles, how to breathe, how to aim. Sarah's hands trembled at first, but she quickly found her rhythm. When her first shot struck near the center of the target, she turned, a little shocked. Colt's expression softened. "Not bad. Luck," she said, trying to sound modest. He shook his head. Instinct. For the first time since leaving Boston, Sarah felt capable, not just a frightened girl in a strange land, but someone who might actually belong here. As the sun sank behind the mountains, Colt gathered the rifles. "Good work. Now lock the doors and stay inside." After dark, Sarah frowned, while Colt's eyes scanned the horizon. Because men like Dalton don't always wait for morning. She felt a shiver crawl up her spine. And what about you? He glanced back at her, the fading light catching his sharp features. I'll be here, watching, and for reasons she couldn't quite explain, that thought, the image of Colt Brennan standing guard through the night, made her feel both safe and strangely unsteady all at once. Night fell like a curtain, heavy and still. The only light came from the lanterns glowing faintly in the ranch windows. Sarah stood at her upstairs window, watching as Colt walked the perimeter, his tall frame cutting a dark silhouette against the moonlit prairie. Every few minutes, he stopped to listen, to the wind, to the distant cries of coyotes, to anything that might not belong. Downstairs, Emma had already gone to bed. Sarah should have too, but her thoughts wouldn't quiet. She kept replaying the day. Dalton's cold smile, the distrust of the ranch hands, Colt's calm, steady voice as he'd taught her to shoot. The feel of the rifle, the sharp smell of gunpowder, the look of approval in his eyes when she'd hit the target. It wasn't fear she felt now. It was something stronger, a pull she couldn't quite understand. She went downstairs, the old wood creaking beneath her feet. Colt was just coming in from outside, his coat dusted with dirt and his expression grim. "Everything all right?" she asked quietly. He nodded, hanging his hat. For now, someone's been watching from the ridge. Couldn't see who, but they weren't friendly. Sarah's pulse quickened. "Do you think it's Dalton's men?" "I'd bet on it," Colt said. "He's testing us." Seeing how we react, he poured himself a cup of coffee, then looked at her, his expression softening. "You should rest, Miss Mitchell." "I can't sleep," she admitted. "Every creak in this house sounds like danger." Colt hesitated, then set his cup down. "Come with me." He led her to the porch, where the air was cool and the stars seemed close enough to touch. The land stretched endlessly before them, wide, wild, and beautiful. "When I first came here," Colt said, "your uncle told me something I never forgot. He said this land tests a person. It doesn't care who you were before you got here, only who you decide to become." Sarah looked at him. "And who did you become?" He smiled faintly, someone who finally stopped running. Quote, there was something in his voice, a weariness she hadn't noticed before, a sadness hidden beneath his strength. "You've lost people," she said softly. Colt's jaw tightened. "Everyone loses someone out here. The trick is learning to live with the ghosts." Sarah wanted to ask more, but a sound from the distance cut through the quiet, the faint echo of horses, fast and many. Colt's expression changed instantly inside. Now, before she could move, headlights, lanterns on horseback, appeared on the ridge. The faint thunder of hooves grew louder. Colt grabbed his rifle and shouted for the ranch hands. Sarah ran to wake Emma. The sisters hurried downstairs, fear twisting in their stomachs. Outside, Colt and the hands were already taking positions behind fences and wagons. "Stay in the pantry," Colt ordered, his voice low but steady. "If anything happens, you don't come out until I do." Sarah wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. She squeezed his arm. "Be careful." He gave a single nod, then turned back to the yard. Moments later, the night exploded into chaos. Shouts, gunfire, the crack of rifles echoing across the open land. Sarah and Emma huddled in the dark pantry, listening as the world above them turned into a storm of noise and fear. The minutes crawled by. Then, suddenly, silence. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. She could hear footsteps, heavy boots, and then the creak of the pantry door. Light spilled in. Colt stood there, face smeared with dust and sweat, but alive. "It's over," he said quietly. "You're safe." Sarah rushed forward, relief flooding her. "Is anyone?" "We lost one horse," he said, "but the men are fine. Dalton's riders won't be back soon." He looked exhausted, older somehow, but there was pride in his eyes, not for himself, but for them, for what they had defended together. The next morning the sun rose over a blackened barn and scattered debris. The cost was high, but the ranch still stood. Sarah and Emma helped the hands rebuild, their city clothes streaked with ash and dirt. They worked until their hands blistered and their muscles burned. That evening, when the fires were out and the land was quiet again, Colt found Sarah sitting on the fence, staring out over the prairie. "You did well," he said. She turned to him, smiling faintly. "So did you." "I just did my job." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You did more than that. You protected what mattered." He looked away, the corner of his mouth lifting. "You sound like your uncle." Sarah's eyes softened. Maybe I'm finally learning what he wanted us to learn. They stood in silence for a long moment, the wind tugging gently at her hair. Then Colt reached out, his hand rough and warm as it closed over hers. "This land's hard," he said quietly, "but sometimes it gives you things worth fighting for." Sarah met his eyes, and in that moment she knew he wasn't just talking about the ranch. For the first time, she didn't feel like a stranger in the West. She felt like she belonged to the land, to the ranch, to the life she was building. And somewhere in that vast, untamed world, she had found something even rarer. She had found a home. The letter came on a cold March morning, the kind that froze breath before it left a man's mouth. Frost clung to the cabin window like dust that refused to melt. Elias Ward sat at his rough wooden table, the paper shaking in his calloused hands. He read the words again and again until they blurred. A mail-order bride was coming. Her name was Clara Milton. The agency in St. Louis said she was a good woman, healthy, honest, willing. But what made Elias's stomach twist was the last line. She will be accompanied by 2 younger dependents. He didn't know what that meant. Cousins, maybe, or helpers. He didn't ask. A man didn't argue with mercy when it showed up in a letter. He hadn't sent for a wife because of love or even loneliness, but because the preacher had said no man should face another winter alone. The mountain was harsh. The silence harsher. 3 weeks later, the stagecoach came climbing up the rocky trail, wheels creaking, dust swirling like smoke in the thin mountain air. Elias waited by the fence, hat in hand, heart thudding harder than any hammer he'd ever swung. The coach stopped, and from its door stepped a woman with travel-worn clothes and eyes that looked older than her face. Behind her came 2 little girls, thin, pale, clutching a torn doll and a tin cup as if they were treasures. Elias froze. Dependence. That's what the letter meant. Sisters. Children. Clara Milton gave him a tired nod. "Mr. Ward?" she said softly. "I'm sorry." They had nowhere else to go. He looked at the paper still folded in his coat pocket, then at her, then at the girls. The driver threw down a small trunk, cracked his whip, and rode off without a word. The sound of the wheels faded into the valley, leaving only wind and silence. Elias cleared his throat. "Cabin's up that way," he said at last. "Ain't much, but it's dry." Clara nodded, lifting the youngest girl into her arms. They walked the narrow path between pines, the snow crunching beneath their boots. Halfway up, the older girl stumbled. Elias picked her up without thinking. She weighed almost nothing. It made his chest ache. When they reached the cabin, he pushed the door open. The smell of smoke and old bread greeted them. He suddenly saw the place through her eyes. Bare walls, 1 chair, 1 bed, 1 man's life. "It's small," he muttered, ashamed. "We've lived in smaller," she said softly. The girls crowded near the fire, their faces glowing orange in the light. Elias realized then they hadn't come looking for a husband. They'd come looking for mercy. That night, the cabin felt too small for 4 hearts, and too quiet for all their memories. Elias moved about awkwardly, setting bowls, pouring hot water, trying not to stare. Clara's sisters huddled close to her like small birds under one wing. "You live here alone?" Clara asked after a while. Her voice carried exhaustion more than curiosity. Elias nodded. "4 winters now." "You built it yourself?" "Mostly." She looked around. "It's strong," she said quietly, and for the first time there was a hint of gratitude in her voice. The youngest girl spilled her stew, flinching as if expecting anger. Elias handed her a cloth and smiled gently. "No harm done." She blinked, then smiled back, small and shy. Later, when the girls were asleep by the hearth, Clara sat near the window, watching the moonlight spread across the snow. Elias sat on the other side of the fire, pretending to whittle, though his knife hadn't moved in minutes. "You got family back east?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not anymore. Fever took my parents. Debt took the house. The girls are all I have." He looked at her for a long moment. "And you thought a mountain would fix that?" She sighed, her eyes glistening. "I thought maybe kindness might." The words hit him harder than a winter storm. Kindness. He'd almost forgotten what it sounded like. "I ain't much," he said quietly, "but you'll be safe here." She turned toward him, searching his face. For the first time that night, her shoulders eased, just a little. The firelight flickered between them, soft and steady, as if the mountain itself had drawn a breath of peace. The next morning, the mountain felt different. The snow was melting, the pines dripping water like rain. Elias woke before dawn, splitting wood, stoking the fire. But this time, he wasn't alone. He heard footsteps behind him, Clara moving around the kitchen, her sleeves rolled, boiling water, sweeping ashes, steady as a sunrise. The girls giggled quietly as they helped her, their laughter thin but alive. Elias stood in the doorway watching, not sure what to do with the warmth that filled the cabin. For years, silence had been his only company. Now there was sound again, soft, human, and good. That afternoon, he saddled his horse to fetch flour and candles from town. Clara walked out with him, the wind tugging her shawl. "You'll come back tonight?" she asked. He nodded. "Before dark. Town's close, but gossip travels faster. Folks'll know you're here." "Let them," she said, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "They won't bother you," he said gently. "Not while you're under my roof." She looked at him, her lips trembling with words she didn't say. When he returned that evening, the smell of bread filled the cabin. Clara had managed to bake with what little they had. The girls were laughing by the fire, playing with small wooden marbles he'd carved long ago. For the first time, he didn't eat alone. Ruth, the eldest, told a story about a talking rabbit that got lost in the snow. Mary said it was a bear, not a rabbit. Clara laughed then, a sound so light it made Elias forget to breathe. It wasn't just laughter. It was hope returning in disguise. When the girls finally slept, Clara stayed by the fire, hands wrapped around her cup. "You didn't ask for all this," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Maybe it was time something found me." Outside, the wind carried a hint of warmth down from the peaks. Inside, for the first time in years, Elias Ward felt something he hadn't known he was missing. Not love, not yet, but belonging, the quiet kind that asks for nothing and gives everything. And far below the mountain, two men were already asking about Clara Milton. It was late afternoon when Elias saw the riders, two of them, moving slow through the melting snow, coats too fine for the wilderness, faces too smooth for mountain work. He watched from the porch as they climbed the muddy path toward the cabin. His gut told him what they were before they even spoke. Men from down below, men who thought paper and ink made them owners of people. "Stay inside," he said quietly to Clara. She obeyed, pulling the girls back from the window, her face pale. The riders stopped in the yard, horses snorting steam into the cold air. The older one dismounted first, brushing dust from his sleeves. "Mr. Ward," he called, voice smooth like a salesman. "We're looking for a woman by the name of Clara Milton." Elias didn't blink. "Don't know her." The younger man spat into the mud. "Funny, then, how her likeness matches the one peeking through your curtain." Elias's jaw tightened. Behind the window, Clara froze. The older man smiled, slow and thin. "She left Wichita owing Mr. Halverson a debt. Travel fees, clothes, lodging. She ran before the paperwork cleared. That makes her his property until paid." Elias's hand dropped to the axe by the porch rail. "Ain't no such thing as property here." Quote, "Law says otherwise," the man said, his tone turning sharp. "You're harboring a runaway, Mr. Ward." Elias took a single step forward. "Then tell your law to come fetch her, but you best come ready." The man exchanged a look, realizing the line had been drawn. The older one tipped his hat mockingly. "You can't keep her hidden forever." I don't plan to, Elias said. She's free to walk this mountain, same as me. Something in his voice made the horses shift uneasily. The men muttered, turned, and rode back down the trail, mud splattering their polished boots. Only when the sound of hooves faded did Elias go inside. Clara was standing near the door, trembling. They won't stop, she whispered. Men like that never do. Elias set his hat down slowly. Then we'll make it hard for them to find you. Her eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean for you to get caught in this. You didn't, he said quietly. I walked into it on my own. She looked up at him. Why? Why are you helping us? He hesitated, the firelight flickering across his face. Because someone should have done the same for my wife once. Clara's breath caught, but she didn't ask more. Some wounds didn't need explaining. The cabin went quiet except for the soft crackle of wood. Outside, the mountains swallowed the last echo of hoofbeats and kept their secret. 3 days later, the rain came, cold and relentless. It turned the paths to rivers and the roof to a steady drum. The 4 of them stayed shut in, the fire, their only son. Clara hung clothes near the hearth, sleeves damp, while the girls built a fort from quilts and boxes. Elias patched the window boards, his knife never far from reach. You carve when you're nervous, Clara said softly, noticing the small block of wood in his hands. I carve when I can't fix what's outside, he replied. Makes me feel like I'm still doing something. She nodded, the tiredness in her eyes mixed with something softer, understanding. By morning, the rain had turned to snow again, thick and quiet. The world outside disappeared in white. Elias chopped more wood while Clara mended torn coats. The girls sang to themselves, their small voices weaving through the cabin like threads of sunlight. That song, Elias said one evening. Where's it from? My father, Clara answered. He used to sing it when the crops failed. Said if the walls still stood after the storm, we were blessed. Elias smiled faintly. Sounds like a man who knew hard times. He did, she whispered, but he died thinking he wasn't blessed at all. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was honest. Elias set down his carving. A small wooden heart with a hole in the center, shaped rough but steady. For your coat, he said. Clara traced it with her thumb. You make things that last. Not always, he said. Sometimes I just make them again when they break. She smiled, the firelight dancing in her eyes. The storm outside no longer sounded cruel. It sounded alive. The next morning, the snow began to melt again, fast this time. The sound of water running down the slope filled the air. Elias went out early to check his traps, and Clara was hanging blankets on the porch when she saw something move in the trees. A man, alone. He was walking, not riding, coat dark with mud, his steps sure. Clara's breath caught. Elias, she called. Elias came running, axe in hand. The stranger raised his hands. I mean no harm, he said. My horse broke a leg near the ridge. I was told a Mr. Ward lives here, a man who can mend things. Elias didn't lower the axe. Depends what needs mending. The man smiled faintly. Just a horse, though I hear you've been fixing hearts too. Clara froze. He was looking right at her. You know me, she said quietly. Wichita, he answered. You worked the boarding house. My brother was the one who kept you there. I told him to let you go. He didn't listen. Elias's grip tightened. You part of that trade? The man shook his head. No, I left it behind. I came to say I'm sorry for what happened and for not stopping it sooner. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, signed by the agency. All debts cleared. Nobody's looking for you anymore. Elias didn't move. You could have sent that by mail. I owed the walk, the man said simply. He placed the letter on a fence post, nodded once, and turned back toward the trees. Clara stared after him, her knees weak. He's telling the truth, she whispered. That's the man who tried to help before it all went wrong. Elias picked up the letter, glanced at the seal, and slipped it into his pocket. Then it's done, he said. You believe him? She asked. Doesn't matter, he said gently. You're free either way. Clara met his eyes, her voice trembling. You keep saying that word. He nodded slowly. Maybe someday you'll believe it. She smiled through tears, the first real smile he'd ever seen on her face. Behind them, the man disappeared into the pines, footsteps fading into the earth. The snow melted faster after that, as if the mountain itself had decided it was time to forgive. By April, the mountain began to bloom again. Streams ran clear, and the scent of pine drifted warm through the valley. The girls spent their days down by the creek, splashing and laughing as if the world had never known pain. Clara mended clothes on the porch, her hair loose in the wind, while Elias repaired the roof, the sound of his hammer echoing across the hills like a heartbeat. The cabin, once a hollow place of silence, had grown full of noise, of warmth, of life. Every corner held something that mattered now: a child's doll near the hearth, a loaf of bread cooling by the window, a woman's laughter tucked between chores. One evening, as the sun sank behind the ridges, Elias came in to find Clara setting bowls on the table. The girls had fallen asleep by the fire, their small hands still clutching marbles. He stopped in the doorway, watching her. The lamplight made her look softer, stronger somehow. "They wore themselves out," she whispered. "They think the mountain's a playground now." He smiled, easing into his chair. Guess it needed the right laughter to wake it up. Clara sat across from him. "Do you ever think about leaving? Going back to town? Or maybe further west?" Quote. Elias looked toward the window where twilight painted the snow-capped peaks in gold. "No," he said. "Every place I ever left stayed inside me anyway. Might as well build where the echoes already know my name." She nodded quietly, tracing the rim of her cup. "When we first came here, I thought I was saving my sisters. But now I think you saved me instead." Elias shook his head. "I didn't save you, Clara. You just stopped apologizing for being alive." Her eyes glistened, tears she didn't bother to hide. The room was silent except for the slow crackle of the fire. Then she reached into her apron and pulled out the folded letter, the same one that had brought her there. "I kept it," she said softly. "I thought I'd burn it when all this was done." "You sure?" he asked. "Sometimes it's good to remember where mercy started." She smiled faintly. "It didn't start with this," she said. "It started the moment someone saw us and didn't turn away." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "Then that's something worth keeping." The next morning, the sun came strong and bright. The girls ran barefoot through wet grass, chasing butterflies. Clara stood at the edge of the field, planting beans in neat rows, humming the tune her father once sang during storms. Elias watched her from the porch, feeling something he hadn't felt since before the world had broken him. Peace. She turned to him, smiling. "You missed a row," she called. He chuckled. "You'll fix it after I'm done anyway." "Probably," she said. "You never leave anything half-mended." He walked over, leaned on his shovel. "That's what living here does. Teaches you to finish what pain started." Clara looked up at him, her eyes soft. "You sound like a preacher." "Maybe I just learned to listen to the land," he said. "It forgives quieter than people do." The wind brushed through the tall grass, carrying the sound of the girls' laughter. For a long while they said nothing. The mountain didn't need words to tell their story anymore. Later that evening, as the fire burned low, Clara set the old letter on the table again. The girls were asleep, their heads resting together under one blanket. She looked at Elias. "I'm ready to let it go," she said. He nodded. "Then let's give it back to the mountain." They stepped outside, the sky wide and clear, stars glittering like silver dust. Clara held the paper over the lantern flame. It caught slow, curling at the edges until it lifted on the wind, glowing orange before fading into ash. "For what it cost us," she whispered, "and for what it gave." Elias stood beside her, the glow lighting his face. "Guess some fires ain't meant to destroy, just to remind us what survived." When the flame was gone, the night fell quiet again. They stood shoulder to shoulder, the air cool, the world finally still. "Funny," she said softly. "I thought you built this life for yourself." He smiled, eyes on the horizon. "Maybe I did. Didn't know it was for 4. She leaned against him, her head resting on his arm. "Maybe the mountain didn't choose who to keep," she whispered. Maybe it chose who to heal. He looked down at her, his voice barely above the wind. Then it did its work. Quote, "They stayed there until dawn began to rise, painting the peaks in soft gold. Inside, the cabin waited, holding their laughter, their scars, their peace. The wind moved through the pines, not as a warning this time, but as a witness. And in that small place between earth and sky, the mountain man who had once lived alone finally belonged, not to the land, not to duty, but to the family that mercy had brought to his door."